In the late 1990s, I actually presented a paper. The first outing of that paper was at the University of Iowa in the USA. This is the late 1990s, and the title of that paper was Translating Culture versus Cultural Translation. Having written that paper, I thought I had got on to something which I considered very important. And therefore, I broke all academic protocol thereafter by giving various versions of the paper over and over again at as many places as I possibly could. And this is the latest in that series. What is even worse in terms of academic protocol is that I'm going on giving this paper in its many avatars, even though I have published it already. It was first published in a web journal that comes out of the University of Iowa. It's called the 91st Meridian. It was then published in a journal in India. It was then published in a book in India, and therefore I cannot blame anyone for not having read it. But then it was reprinted, the whole book, not only my article, by Benjamins, who are one of the greatest publishers in the world on translation. And still nobody has read it, which is my justification for going on doing this paper to as many people as possible. If you do not read me, whenever I can capture you in a room, you'll have to listen to me. The other reason for my going on doing this paper is that I feel that cultural translation, the rise of cultural translation, is an extremely dangerous development. We need to stop it as soon as we can. Translating culture is one thing. But cultural translation, this new terminology, this new phrase, it seems to me is extremely deleterious to the health of translation. And if we do not do something to contain it straight away, it would have swallowed up translation as we have always known it, and that, from my point of view, from where I come from, would not be a good thing at all. As I said, I have a paper. I do not have slides, I do not have cornflake boxes, but I do have a paper. I will not read all of it. In the beginning here, I traced very briefly how translation studies have got where they have. Translation has never been so big in the history of the world. It's been noticed more. Translation has always been big. What was the Renaissance, if not a major act of translation? But translation has been recognized to be translation. Translation has become visible as translation. And translation is being systematically analyzed and studied now in a way that is unprecedented. Since the late or mid-1970s or the 1980s, there has been something that we call translation studies as a separate or semi-separate academic discipline or subdiscipline. And that has led to a consolidation of how we read translation, how we approach translation in a way that, as I said, had never been done before. How did translation begin to be studied? It's a recent phenomenon. Earlier, it was part of linguistics. The assumption was that translation was the transaction between two languages, and therefore the proper field under which to study it would be linguistics. This continued for a long time. Then, there was also, parallel to that, the idea that translation was actually part of comparative literature. And that was another broader umbrella under which translation was parked for quite some time. Translation has now emerged from both these long shadows to become, for some of us, if not for all of us, a discipline or at least a subdiscipline. That is a development, an academic development that needs a disciplinary development that needs to be noted and that perhaps needs to be celebrated and welcomed. Meanwhile, well, there was also a hope. briefly, after the cultural turn in translation studies, as some theorists of translation have called it, most notably Susan Bassnett and André Lefebvre, after the cultural turn in translation studies, hope was expressed, again in the late 1990s, in a book that the two of them published, that there might be a corresponding and responsive translation turn in cultural studies. That the two new subdisciplines or disciplines should join forces and do the work that they have carved out as separate territories, though really it belongs to both together. In that book that I referred to, published in 1998, I think it was, Constructing Cultures, Bassnett and Lefebvre said, and I quote, "In these multifaceted interdisciplines," and they mean translation studies and cultural studies, "in these multifaceted interdisciplines, isolation is counterproductive. The study of translation, like the study of culture, needs a plurality of voices. And similarly, the study of culture always involves an examination of the processes of encoding and decoding that comprise translation." But nothing happened. This appeal on the part of two of the top experts in translation studies of our times fell on deaf cultural studies ears. They did not respond. They were growing at an enormous rate anyhow. Cultural studies are the big headlines from a disciplinary point of view of the last 3 or 4 decades. Everybody wants to do cultural studies. And one of the reasons was suggested by Terry Eagleton. He said, if you do cultural studies, you can plonk yourself down in front of the TV set and get up 4 years later with a PhD. That's what cultural studies are about, in many people's view. So everybody wants a share of that. Now, what happened meanwhile was that the term cultural, translating culture was always part of translation, in the senses described by Ithamar, except 1 or 2, to which I'll return. But it was not called cultural translation. About 8 or 10 years ago, I forget now precisely when, I checked the British Library catalogue, typing in the phrase cultural translation, and only one book came up, which was about the first of the many meanings that Ithamar referred to, a translation into Spanish, I think, of a text which was oriented deliberately towards the Spanish reader and therefore in that sense could be called cultural translation. That was the only sense available 10 years back among the many resources, the profound resources of the British Library. Last year, a few months back, I typed in cultural translation again in the BL catalogue, and now they have 11 books. It's been happening before our eyes. And the sad thing is that people who do translation studies have not noticed it. They're beginning to notice it only now. The Wikipedia entry is perfectly right in one word, when it says cultural studies is a new development in translation. It's very new. How new? There is an encyclopedia of translation studies done by Mona Baker, and it does not have an entry on cultural translation. There is a translation studies reader edited by Larry Venuti, and it does not have cultural translation even in the index. That's how new it is. And why was it ignored by translation studies? Why not ignored deliberately? Why were translation studies ignorant of this development? Because it arose elsewhere. Because the term arose in another field of study, with which translation studies does not wish to have much to do, it seems. And that field is, again, a large field, a booming field, which is postcolonialism, postcolonial discourse. There was this term available in anthropology already. In the 1960s, there was a book published called Cultural Translation. It was a festschrift for Evans Pritchard, the great British anthropologist. The title is Cultural Translation. Inside the book, there is not a single reference to cultural translation. The term is never explained. Nobody knows what it is. And that perhaps is for the reason that at that stage of the evolution of anthropology, everybody was in tacit agreement about what cultural translation is in anthropological terms. It was going and observing another culture from inside it, coming back and writing it up, but in writing it up, not using a single word from the language of that other culture, describing it in one's own language. That was called cultural translation. Of course, anthropologists have never succeeded in doing that. There is this taboo that one should not use the language of the observed culture, except that the word taboo comes from one such language. This is a self-fulfilling, non-fulfilling condition. Now it's been discussed again in terms of the term cultural translation and been problematized to some extent in anthropology, particularly by James Clifford, whose major contribution, James Clifford has revolutionized anthropology, at least theoretically. He has shifted the paradigm in a very big way, and is extremely popular and trendy and fashionable among anthropologists. And what he says is, among many other things, that the best place to observe cultures is not in a remote village, but in airport lounges. The best place to analyze culture is not, again, through in situ objects far away. Why bother? It can be done in museums. It can be better done in museums. So he's made that kind of a contribution, and this is a new version of cultural translation as anthropologists understand it. But I wish to devote a few minutes to where I think the term first gained currency, the postcolonial discourse, and how it is that the term now comes into translation studies with all that postcolonial baggage, which people in translation studies haven't the foggiest clue to. That's why it's a mismatch. If there is one thing that cultural translation is not in postcolonial discourse, it is the translation of culture. It's as absurd, or as they say in theory, as characteristic a use of the term cultural translation as that. In fact, it spells out, as I'm going to argue, the very extinction and erasure of translation as we have always known and cherished it. The most comprehensive, sophisticated, and influential formulation of the concept of cultural translation occurs in the work of probably the foremost post-colonial / postmodernist theorist of our times, Homi Bhabha. It is in the last chapter, bar the conclusion of his book, The Location of Culture, his only book, 1994, titled, and the chapter is titled, How Newness Enters the World, Postmodern Space, Postcolonial Times, and the Trials of Cultural Translation. That's the first major use of this term in that chapter title that I have been able to track down in postcolonial studies. In Bhabha's discussion, the literary text treated as the preeminent example of cultural translation is Salman Rushdie's novel Satanic Verses, a novel written originally in English and read in English by Homi Bhabha, but he still calls it cultural translation. A clue to the new sense in which the term translation is being used here in the phrase cultural translation is suggested by a remark made by Rushdie himself, which Bhabha does not cite in his article, but which is cited frequently everywhere else, in which Rushdie said of himself and other diasporic writers, "We are translated men." This he said a long time back. Rushdie is here exploiting the etymology of the word translation, which means to carry or to bear across, and what he meant therefore was that because he had been borne across, presumably in an aeroplane, from India and Pakistan to the United Kingdom, he was therefore a translated man. He does not tell us whether before getting onto that airport he was ever an original man. I mentioned this to Ngugi wa Thiong'o in a conversation I had with him, a post-colonial writer for whose use of language, switching from English to his own language, Gikuyu, in mid-career, I have a tremendous amount of respect. He is a true post-colonial writer in a way that most post-colonial writers that we talk about, who are Anglophone writers and who are sleeping with the enemy, as John Updike said, in using the English language, are not. Ngugi wa Thiong'o said to me, I said, Rushdie says he's a translated man. Do you feel similarly? And he said, no, not at all. I am a transported man. He was exiled from his country for his political attitudes and writings. So he said, I'm a transported man in the older sense, when criminals were transported. But a second and overriding sense in which too Rushdie claimed to be a translated man is the sense exploited by Homi Bhabha in that essay. Bhabha begins with an epigraph from Walter Benjamin's classic essay on translation, and I'm quoting Bhabha, quoting Benjamin. It says, translation passes through continua of transformation, not abstract ideas of identity and similarity. Later, developing this, Bhabha brings in Derrida's deconstruction of Benjamin's concept of translation as an afterlife or survival in order to deploy this concept in a wholly new context unintended by either Benjamin or Derrida. And this new context is the context of Rushdian migrancy and hybridity. Allow me to quote a passage from Homi Bhabha. It's not so early in the morning. I hope you've had breakfast. I hope you're not feeling too feeble. If hybridity, I quote Bhabha, if hybridity is heresy, then to blaspheme is to dream. I hope you got that one. It sounds so wonderful. It's so poetic. I'll read it again. If hybridity is heresy, then to blaspheme is to dream. It is the dream of translation as survival. As Derrida translated the time of Benjamin's concept of the afterlife of translation as survivre, the act of living on borderlines. Rushdie, this is still Bhabha, Rushdie translates this into the migrant's dream of survival, an initiatory interstices, an empowering condition of hybridity. I could quote more, but what's the use?